For most people today, the name Sun Tzu immediately conjures images of battlefields, ancient generals, and bite-sized strategy quotes recycled into business memes by people who've never opened the book itself. He's often portrayed as a prophet of victory, a mysterious genius who cracked the hidden psychology of war. But that popular image completely misses the real point. Because once you peel away the slogans and strip out the myth, something far more compelling appears. Sun Tzu was never fixated on winning fights. He was fixated on preventing them. He didn't chase glory, discipline, or domination. His obsession was cost, and in a world slowly bleeding itself dry through endless conflict, Sun Tzu became one of the first thinkers to state an uncomfortable reality. The greatest threat to a state isn't the enemy across the field, it's the invoice that arrives afterward. People assume the art of war is about combat. In truth, it's about economics. Welcome to the Financial Historian, where money, power, and history collide, and where nothing is ever as simple as it seems. If you enjoy history viewed through this lens, make sure to subscribe. To grasp Sun Tzu's financial brilliance, you first need to understand the world that shaped him. Because his ideas didn't emerge in isolation. They were forged in a society buckling under the pressure of its own ambitions. China during the late spring and autumn period and the early warring states era, roughly the 6th to 5th centuries, BCE, was fragmented into rival kingdoms, each convinced it was destined to rule them all, and each straining its coffers in the attempt. Warfare was relentless. Alliances formed, collapsed, and reformed. Armies expanded with every passing generation, evolving from elite chariot skirmishes into enormous infantry forces that demanded food, metal, logistics, and taxation on a scale previously unimaginable. These states weren't merely fighting wars. They were putting their entire economies under extreme stress. Every time a ruler sent troops into the field, he was effectively borrowing against the future of his kingdom. And more often than not, those debts eventually came due. Modern audiences often picture ancient warfare as heroic and tactical, but in this era, war was first and foremost a logistical problem. The instant an army began to move, costs started accumulating. Wagons had to roll, grain had to be stored and transported, horses, craftsmen, armorers, cooks, blacksmiths, and porters all had to be supplied or paid. A campaign that dragged on for a few months could financially ruin a small state. One that stretched beyond the year could bring down a powerful one. Yet because these kingdoms lived in constant fear of one another, they kept fighting regardless. It was an arms race long before the phrase existed, and it pushed the political system to its breaking point. This was the environment Sun Tzu entered. Not as a detached philosopher lost in meditation, but as a strategist confronting an economic emergency disguised as a military one. In the West, he's often romanticized as an ancient advisor to CEOs, but in reality, he functioned more like a risk analyst. He examined expenses, timelines, logistics, and sustainability, and recognized that the prevailing way wars were fought simply could not continue. Winning meant nothing if the treasury collapsed afterward. Most rulers never saw that. They believed the enemy's army posed the greatest danger. Sun Tzu believed the real threat was their own spending. That's why the most critical sentence in The Art of War appears right at the beginning, before any discussion of deception, terrain, or morale. Sun Tzu writes, "War is of vital importance to the state. Not noble, not honorable, vital meaning volatile, disruptive, and capable of destroying the society it claims to protect." The rest of the book is essentially a guide to keeping war limited, controlled, and as inexpensive as possible. And in doing so, it exposes his true fixation, reducing financial risk. Even his most quoted ideas reveal themselves as economic logic. When examined closely, when he says, "The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting," he isn't speaking metaphorically. He is describing cost avoidance. It's the ancient version of achieving results without burning capital. When he warns that no nation has ever benefited from prolonged warfare, he's stating a straightforward fiscal reality. Extended campaigns steadily hollow out a state's ability to function. And when he emphasizes speed, efficiency, intelligence, and psychological pressure, it's because these tools are far cheaper than massed armies. Sun Tzu wasn't focused on winning battles. He was focused on stopping nations from bankrupting themselves while trying to win them. To see just how radical this perspective was, you have to look at Chinese warfare before Sun Tzu. For generations, Aristocratic elites engaged in ritualized conflicts where honor mattered more than outcomes, and economic consequences were barely considered. But as populations expanded and military technology evolved, warfare scaled into something entirely different. States standardized currency, overhauled taxation, and built bureaucracies simply to keep their armies operational. War became a national endeavor and an existential financial gamble. Sun Tzu recognized that the old mentality had become lethal. Conflict could no longer serve as a stage for symbolic gestures or noble displays. It had turned into a budgetary threat that demanded ruthless, unemotional calculation. This is what makes Sun Tzu such a rarity in world history. While most military thinkers glorified combat, he reduced it to accounting. He evaluated supply chains, resource depletion, and opportunity cost centuries before those concepts had names. He had little tolerance for commanders who chased prestige at the expense of stability. Because he understood a truth that many modern leaders still overlook. Every battlefield decision is ultimately a decision about national solvency. Get it wrong, and you don't just lose troops, you lose the state itself. Viewed through this economic lens, the art of war stops reading like ancient verse and starts resembling a ledger. Sun Tzu begins by outlining 5 core factors that determine victory, and beneath their philosophical language lies a clear reality. They are cost variables, the moral law, heaven, earth, the commander, and method and discipline aren't mystical abstractions. They are categories of resource management. He's asking practical questions. What will this war demand? How stable is your society? How resilient are your people? How efficiently can forces move? How disciplined is your administration? He's conducting a risk assessment long before such a concept existed. From the opening lines, Sun Tzu makes it clear that leaders who can't calculate cost have no business calculating strategy. That's why so much of the book dwells on logistics rather than heroism. Sun Tzu dedicates an entire section to the economics of sustaining an army, and his reasoning is ruthless. When an army is 20 miles from home, the cost of 100 measures of grain is lost. The message is simple. Distance raises expenses, and time multiplies them. He explains that transporting supplies drains the treasury faster than paying soldiers, that keeping troops in the field weakens agricultural production, and that careless commanders can bankrupt a nation while winning trivial skirmishes. For a military manual, it shows remarkably little interest in fighting itself, and an almost obsessive concern with what fighting costs. He urges rulers to live off enemy resources whenever possible, not as a clever tactic, but as a fiscal necessity. He condemns prolonged campaigns not because they show hesitation, but because they demonstrate financial irresponsibility. Sun Tzu grasps something many modern states forget. Logistics don't merely support strategy. They are a strategy. His treatment of intelligence follows the same economic logic. Today, debates over surveillance and intelligence funding revolve around ethics, security, or national interest. Sun Tzu framed the issue in terms of efficiency. One well-placed spy, he argued, could stop an entire army from marching into disaster. A single intercepted message could save vast sums. He wrote that what allows wise rulers and capable generals to achieve extraordinary results is foreknowledge, not brute strength or courage. Foreknowledge was simply the ancient term for data. To Sun Tzu, information wasn't an accessory to war, it was the cheapest and most powerful weapon available. He was the first strategist to recognize that wasting information is the same as wasting capital. Even his emphasis on speed is fundamentally economic. Speed is the essence of war. He writes a line often mistaken for a call to aggression, but his real point is subtler. Speed reduces cost. When he urges commanders to strike where the enemy least expects it, he is describing a cost-benefit maneuver, using timing and deception to bypass the expense of direct confrontation. Every day an army marches, waits, and eats increases financial exposure. A delayed victory is money lost. A victory achieved through maneuver, rather than attrition, preserves resources. His preference for flexibility, adaptability, and psychological leverage isn't philosophical ornamentation, it's fiscal discipline. At the deepest level, the entire structure of the art of war revolves around opportunity cost. Every decision eliminates a cheaper alternative. Sun Tzu doesn't reject war outright, he rejects waste. And to him, the greatest waste of all is fighting battles that never needed to happen. That's why he praises generals who dissolve resistance without bloodshed, who succeed through diplomacy, intimidation, misdirection, or alliances. These aren't secondary methods. They're primary strategies, because they conserve limited capital. In one of his most revealing warnings, Sun Tzu cautions that rulers who delight in warfare will destroy their own kingdoms. Beneath the poetic phrasing lies a cold accounting truth. Treat war like a passion instead of a liability, and default is inevitable. History around him reinforced this lesson. Some states exhausted their wealth on prolonged sieges that eroded their tax base and sparked internal unrest. Others applied Sun Tzu's logic, relying on intelligence, alliances, and swift action to avoid economic collapse. The states that viewed war as a financial instrument, something to be used sparingly and deliberately, endured longer. Those that treated it as a test of honor or brute force burned themselves out. Sun Tzu wasn't just correct in theory, events repeatedly proved him right. This is where the analysis stops being ancient and becomes unmistakably modern. Because Sun Tzu's warnings echo through every major conflict of the last 2 centuries. Governments still make the same mistakes he tried to prevent. They enter wars without fully accounting for long-term economic strain, then watch their budgets fracture. The Soviet Union in Afghanistan, the United States in Vietnam, European empires in World War I. These wars weren't lost due to military weakness alone. They failed because the economic systems supporting them collapsed. Sun Tzu would have recognized a pattern immediately. Extended conflict corrodes the state faster than any enemy. At the same time, the tools he advocated, intelligence, deception, targeted force, rapid maneuver, dominate modern strategy, precisely because they are cheaper. Cyber warfare is Sun Tzu, sanctions are Sun Tzu, proxy conflicts, covert influence, strategic deterrence, all aim to achieve results, while limiting financial exposure. The world's most powerful nations still operate within Sun Tzu's balance sheet, whether they admit it or not. Perhaps the clearest modern reflection of his thinking lies in how states now define power itself. Sun Tzu believed a nation's strength rested not solely in its armies, but in its economic resilience, its capacity to absorb shocks, recover, and continue functioning. He lived in an age where kingdoms collapsed by overspending on wars they couldn't sustain. Today's great powers face the same equation in different form: defense budgets, mounting debt, resource dependencies, fragile supply chains, and the escalating cost of projecting force. Sun Tzu might not recognize the technology, but he would immediately recognize the numbers. The deeper lesson, the one most people overlook, is that Sun Tzu was never teaching rulers how to win wars. He was teaching them how to avoid bankruptcy. His real genius was understanding that the cost of conflict always outlasts the conflict itself. States don't fall because they lose battles. They fall because they exhaust the capital that keeps them stable, confident, and functional. In Sun Tzu's framework, victory means nothing if the treasury collapses afterward. The best war is the one that doesn't leave your economy needing repair. Seen through this lens, the art of war becomes something entirely different. It isn't a manual of aggression. It's a guide to restraint. It isn't about overpowering rivals. It's about enduring longer than they can. Sun Tzu doesn't celebrate conquest. He celebrates stability. To him, the ruler who preserves resources is wiser than the one who captures cities. The general who wins without fighting surpasses the one who annihilates armies. And the state that knows when not to act is stronger than the one driven by pride. Sun Tzu's philosophy isn't that of a warrior. It's the philosophy of a steward, someone tasked with safeguarding the long-term solvency of a nation. In the end, Sun Tzu's financial brilliance lies in his refusal to separate economics from power. He understood they are inseparable, that war is simply the most expensive policy choice a state can make, and that misjudging its cost is a death sentence. His message remains stark, unsettling, and timeless. Strength isn't measured by how hard you strike, but by how much striking costs you. History shows that when financial systems collide, victory doesn't belong to the bravest, it belongs to the most disciplined. History may not repeat itself, but ignorance always sends the bill. If this changed how you see the past, subscribe. History holds the answers, and I'll show you where to look.